Once upon a time, in a small town called New York City. Hey, I'm trying to tell a story here. Anyway. So, there was a sandwich named Cubie. Cubie didn't remember this, but he was left on a doorstep of a very kind couple who took him in and raised him as their own. As Cubie grew, he became a fine sandwich, and one day, when he was old enough, he was sent out on his own. That Friday night, he was hanging out with his friends, and the conversation turned to their futures. As they debated about what they would do with themselves, one friend turned to Cubie and asked,
"So what's the Cuban sandwich going to do with his life?"
Cubie searched the room for whom his friend could be speaking about, and then realized the question was directed at himself. Cubie said to his friend, "I don't understand."
Come on, Cubie. You're so naive. Is it not true you're made of Cuban bread?
Yeah?
And don't you have shredded pork and glazed ham?
Sure, Cubie replied.
And don't you have Swiss cheese, mustard, and pickles?
Protesting, Cubie continued, "Okay, but..."
Dude, you're a Cuban sandwich.
Cubie left that night with a lot of questions on his mind. Questions that he could only ask of two people. Sitting with the only family he knew, he began to inquire about his past. He learned that he had been left on a doorstep, and that he was indeed a Cuban sandwich. It all began to make sense. All the times the neighbor's dog chased him down the street, and the time that Aunt Mildred tried to cut him into pieces for party appetizers, and how every time he walked in the rain, he had to dry out for 3 whole days. Cubie also learned that his parents didn't know where he came from. This left Cubie with a desire to know more. Desperate, he went to see the only person in the neighborhood that he knew to ask next, Gabin Guido. Gabin Guido wasn't the most on-the-level character, but he did know a few things. They made a deal. In exchange for Cubie's lettuce, Guido offered to tell him everything he knew about Cuban sandwiches.
You want to know about Cuban sandwiches, huh, kid? They're from Cuba. Where else?
Cubie knew at that point he'd been taken advantage of. But, having nothing else to go on, Cubie decided to head to Cuba. In Cuba, he asked a lot of questions, but received no clear direction. A few more deals later, he began to understand it's a pretty harsh world. However, he heard a mention that in the late 1800s, many Cuban sandwiches migrated to Florida. Cubie decided to head to Key West. He found it to be a tourist town and a party city. He visited a museum and found out that the cigar trade had moved to Tampa in the early 1880s, bringing the Cuban sandwich with it. On his last day in Key West, he met a guy who said he should check out the Cuban scene in Miami, so he went there first. Miami was a huge place with tons of things to do and so much culture. Cubie took his own tour of the city. He spent a lot of time exploring places like South Miami, where there was a ton of Latin culture, but he couldn't find exactly what he was looking for anywhere. One day, Cubie was walking along South Beach when it began to rain. He noticed a Cuban cafe and quickly ducked inside, figuring he could ask a few questions. He began talking to the person behind the counter when he heard a familiar voice from a nearby table.
What are you doing this for, South kid?
It was Sal, the Cuban-Italian sandwich from New York. Cubie told Sal all about his adventures, how he'd found out that he was a Cuban, and his search that had led him to Miami. Then he inquired why Sal was in town.
Came down to visit my mom for a while, and I was about to head back to Tampa where I got a place. After all you've been through, why don't you come with me to Tampa for a while? I know you can find your answers there.
And so Cubie said to his old friend Sal, "I was actually heading there next." And they were off. Sal took Cubie out for a night on the town in Ybor City. It was great fun, and Sal shared with him the history of the Cuban sandwich. How the Cuban sandwich was born in Cuba, and by the 1860s it showed up in Key West, where the cigar rollers and sugar workers would travel for work. How in the 1880s it migrated to Tampa, where salami was added, and it morphed into the sandwich we know today. And by the 1960s it was already pretty common in Miami cafeterias and restaurants when, after Fidel Castro's rise to power, many Cuban expatriates settled there. Sal finished with how it can now be found in places with other Cuban settlement areas: New York, New Jersey, Chicago, and Puerto Rico, among others. It was a lot to think about, but then Sal shared with Cubie that he knew Cubie's true story, and Cubie was all ears again.
Kid, before I lay it on you, it's about time we get you pressed. It's time you came of age.
Cubie had heard about being pressed before. It was something that some sandwiches did. But he wanted to know so badly where he come from. So off they went to get pressed. Walking down the street after his pressing, all warm and gooey inside and feeling pretty good, Sal began to tell Cubie his roots.
I hate to be the one to tell you. I really thought you knew. But you were left on the doorstep of Mr. and Mrs. Panini when you were very young, by the neighbors. That same thing happened to me, too. You and me, kid. Kinda lucky we made it this far, you know? We were supposed to be lunch.
There's a bit of history in everyday things, like the Cuban sandwich and the culture it brings. Shredded pork and glazed ham, Cuban bread with Swiss cheese, pickle slices, yellow mustard, add salami if you please. Shredded pork and glazed ham, Cuban bread with Swiss cheese, pickle slices, yellow mustard, add salami if you please. Si usted quiere something good to eat, el sandwich cubano is a special treat. Shredded pork and glazed ham, Cuban bread with Swiss cheese, pickle slices, yellow mustard, add salami if you please. Come on everybody, on your feet! It all comes together, what a combination. A piece from everyone improves the situation. Are you gonna make it? Shredded pork and glazed ham, Cuban bread with Swiss cheese, pickle slices, yellow mustard, add salami if you please. It's a Tampa favorite, eat it cold, press it hot. Breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it's gonna hit the spot. Bring it all together now. Shredded pork and glazed ham, Cuban bread with Swiss cheese, pickle slices, yellow mustard, add salami if you please. Viva la Tampa! A Slice of Tampa, Imaginary Mind Productions Company, Tampa, Florida. Copyright 2012, all rights reserved.